Billionaire marries an ugly beggar woman on a bet. But when it was the wedding night, he discovers that. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. Mentkey, lights of the Plaza Hotel shone with extraordinary intensity on that gala night. The main ballroom, decorated with arrangements of white orchids and Swarovski crystals, reflected the luxury and opulence characteristic of New York high society. Richard Bennett adjusted his Hermes tie for the third time in front of the gilded lobby mirror. His fingers, though steady, betrayed an unusual restlessness for someone so accustomed to the spotlight. The engagement party that would celebrate his union with Brittany Morgan, heiress to one of the country's largest business empires, would be the cherry on top of his social ascension. At 35, Richard had built his own empire, transforming risky investments into resounding successes. His name was synonymous with power, influence, and above all, absolute control. The first guests were beginning to arrive, and the elegant murmur filled the environment. Socialites in designer dresses, businessmen with watches that cost small, fortunes and politicians with rehearsed smiles composed the perfect scenario that Richard had meticulously planned. Every detail of that night had been thought out to consolidate his position at the top of the social pyramid. "Mr. Bennett, Miss Morgan has just arrived," announced the master of ceremonies, interrupting his thoughts. Richard nodded with a half-smile, adjusting his custom-made suit one more time. The murmur of the crowd increased when Brittany entered the hall, stunning in her red Valentino dress. The bride crossed the room with the grace typical of someone born and raised among privileges. Her smile, normally calculated, seemed different that night. There was something enigmatic, almost defiant in her eyes. Richard, an expert at reading people and situations, felt a slight discomfort, but quickly dismissed it as pre-party nervousness. "Darling," Brittany greeted him with a cold kiss on the cheek. "We need to make our speech soon. I have an unavoidable commitment later." The phrase, seemingly innocent, carried a tone that Richard couldn't decipher. Before he could question it, she had already headed to the center of the hall, where a microphone was strategically positioned. Champagne flutes were distributed, and the murmur gradually ceased when Brittany signaled that she would make her announcement. Richard walked up to her, maintaining the perfectly rehearsed smile that so characterized him. The cameras of the main social columnists were all directed at the couple. "Good evening, everyone," Brittany began, her melodious voice echoing through the sound system. "I deeply appreciate the presence of each of you on this special night." She made a dramatic pause, her eyes scanning the audience. "As you know, we are here to celebrate my engagement to Richard Bennett, a man whom you all know for his extraordinary ability to transform everything he touches into gold." Richard smiled, satisfied with the introduction. His gaze swept the hall, noting with pleasure the nods of approval from the guests. The moment was exactly as he had planned. "However, Brittany," continued, her voice taking on a different tone, "there is something I need to share with all of you." Richard's smile froze. "After months of reflection, I realized that I cannot proceed with this engagement." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, but maintained his erect posture, his face a mask of composure. Richard Bennett is without a doubt an extraordinary man in many ways. He knows exactly how to manipulate numbers, stocks, and investments. He knows precisely how to transform failed businesses into resounding successes. Brittany made a calculated pause. But there is something that Richard doesn't know how to do. Love. The camera flashes began to fire frantically. The murmur grew in the hall, and Richard could see cell phones being raised to record the moment. "This man," she continued, gesturing toward him, "sees relationships as business transactions. For him, a marriage is nothing more than another successful business merger, and I refuse to be just another asset in his investment portfolio." Richard remained motionless, his face a mask of indifference that cost all his self-control to maintain. In his ears, the sound of whispers and muffled laughter grew like a wave. "So, dear guests, I apologize for bringing you here under false pretenses. There will be no engagement today. There will be no wedding. What there will be is a woman choosing her own happiness instead of a social contract." With these words, Brittany removed the engagement ring, an exclusive piece of emerald and diamonds, and placed it on the nearest table. The sound of the jewel touching the marble seemed to echo throughout the hall. Richard observed in a mixture of horror and fascination as his fiancée, now ex-fiancée, walked toward the exit of the hall, the red dress undulating like a war flag. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds before the murmur exploded in deafening proportions. His cell phone was already vibrating incessantly in his pocket, undoubtedly with notifications from social media and messages from press officers. In a matter of minutes, he knew that the video of his public humiliation would be circulating through all the WhatsApp groups of New York high society. 3 days had passed since the disaster at the Plaza Hotel. Richard had taken refuge in his penthouse on Central Park West, ignoring the hundreds of calls and messages that kept coming in. The headlines of the main gossip sites spoke of nothing. Elsan, the heartless billionaire. Richard Bennett, the man who doesn't know how to love. The bride who said no to the Bennett empire. That morning, as he watched the sunrise from the balcony of his apartment, something inside him broke. It wasn't just his reputation that was at stake. It was his pride, his essence. Brittany's words echoed in his mind like a cruel mantra. A man incapable of love. Impulsively, he put on his running clothes and decided to go out. He needed to clear his mind, and the Central Park jogging track had always been his refuge in difficult hours. The sun was still low on the horizon when his feet touched the path. He ran as if he could leave behind all the humiliation of the last few days. It was then that he saw her for the first time. Near the East 72nd Street entrance, a young woman was performing movements that looked like a dance. Even in simple and worn clothes, there was a natural elegance in her gestures. Her arms moved with the grace of a ballet dancer, while her bare feet drew patterns on the ground. Richard slowed his pace, intrigued. The woman didn't seem to care about the curious glances of the few morning park-goers. She was absorbed in her own performance, as if the world around her didn't exist. There was something hypnotic about the way she moved, a dignity that contrasted strongly with her apparent situation. He stopped completely, watching her with growing interest. A street vendor approached her, offering water. To his surprise, the young woman declined with a gentle smile and a "thank you very much," pronounced with surprisingly clear diction. It was at that moment that an idea began to form in his mind, an absurd, risky, and potentially brilliant idea. If Brittany accused him of being incapable of connecting emotionally with people, he would prove otherwise, and he would do it in the most extraordinary way possible. He approached her cautiously, noting that up close her features were even more interesting. There was a resilience in her gaze, a strength that the adversities of life had not managed to erase. "Good morning," he initiated, maintaining a respectful distance. "Pardon my intrusion, but I couldn't help but notice your movements. Do you have training in dance?" The woman looked at him with a mixture of surprise and distrust. Her eyes, a deep brown, evaluated him for a few seconds before responding. "I did," she answered simply, her voice surprisingly melodious. "In another life." "My name is Richard," he introduced himself, deliberately omitting his last name. "And you are?" "Claire," she replied, still maintaining a defensive posture, but without hostility. Richard took a deep breath, knowing that his next words might sound completely insane. "Claire, I'll be direct. I have a proposal for you. A proposal that could change your life." She raised an eyebrow, a gesture that, even in her current situation, carried a natural elegance. "What kind of proposal?" "A chance to start over. 30 days under my roof with etiquette lessons, diction, fashion, everything necessary to transform you into a lady of high society." He paused, observing her reaction. "At the end of that period, there will be a public wedding, with press coverage. In exchange, you will receive a sum sufficient to completely change your reality." Claire stared at him in silence for long seconds, her eyes never leaving his. When she finally spoke, her voice had a tone of challenge. "And what makes you think I would accept being your social experiment?" "Because it's not just about you or about me," Richard responded, surprising himself with his own sincerity. "It's about proving that transformations are possible, that people can change, evolve, surprise. Claire took a step forward, and Richard noticed that even in her current situation, she maintained an erect posture, almost majestic. "I have my conditions," she declared, her voice firm. "And what would they be?" "Absolute respect, freedom of choice in all decisions, and..." She made a significant pause. "Part of the money must be allocated to creating a social project for women in vulnerable situations." Richard felt a genuine smile form on his lips for the first time in days. This woman was much more than she appeared. "We have a deal," he extended his hand. Richard's luxurious apartment on Central Park West seemed like a different planet to Claire. As the private elevator rose to the penthouse, she observed her reflection in the mirror, conscious of the contrast between her current appearance and the sophisticated environment. Still, she maintained her erect posture, a reminiscence of the years of ballet that not even adversities had managed to erase. "This will be your room," announced Richard, opening the door to a suite larger than any place where Claire had lived in recent years. The decoration in shades of blue and white was elegant, without being ostentatious, and the view of Central Park was breathtaking. "The classes start tomorrow," he continued, while Claire absorbed every detail of the environment. "Helen Davidson, I will be your main mentor. She was one of the country's greatest models." Something in Richard's tone of voice when mentioning Helen caught Claire's attention, but she kept this observation to herself. "In the closet, you'll find some basic pieces to start with." He gestured toward a mirrored door. "A personal shopper will come later today to help with the rest of the wardrobe. Feel free to take a shower and rest. Dinner will be served at 8. Claire waited for Richard to leave before finally allowing her emotions to surface. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the Egyptian cotton sheets of the king-size bed. It was surreal to be there, as if she had crossed a portal to another dimension. She headed to the suite's bathroom and, upon encountering the immense jacuzzi bathtub, felt silent tears run down her face. They weren't tears of joy or sadness, but of a complex emotion she couldn't name. The contrast between her reality of the last few years and this new scenario was overwhelming. As the bathtub filled, Claire reflected on the events that had brought her here. She remembered the cultural project where she danced, the performances for children from the periphery, the dreams interrupted when the funding was cut. The spiral of difficulties that followed now seemed a distant nightmare, although it had happened just 2 years ago. The bath was almost medicinal. Upon exiting, she found in the closet a selection of clothes in neutral tones, pants, blouses, and simple dresses, but from expensive brands. She chose a navy blue dress that fit her surprisingly well. Her reflection in the mirror revealed a woman she almost didn't recognize anymore, but whose eyes still maintained the same determination as always. At 8 o'clock sharp, Claire went down for dinner. The table was set for 2, with a discreet elegance that seemed to be the trademark of that house. Richard was already waiting for her, wearing more casual clothes that contrasted with the impeccable suit of the morning. "You look more comfortable," he commented, indicating the chair where she should sit. "The dress fits perfectly." "Thank you," replied Claire, observing the multiple utensils arranged next to the French porcelain plate. "I confess I'm a little intimidated by all this apparatus." Richard smiled, for the first time genuinely. "That's why Helen will start with the etiquette classes tomorrow. But for today, don't worry about it, just dine." During the meal, they chatted about superficial matters, testing the limits of that strange partnership. Claire noticed that Richard avoided talking about himself, directing all questions to her. It was as if he were conducting an interview, very well disguised as a casual dinner. "Why do you still dance in the park?" he asked suddenly, surprising her. Claire placed her fork delicately, a gesture that demonstrated her natural grace. "Because dance is not something we do only on stages or in studios. It's a way of existing in the world. Even without having a place to train anymore, my body still needs this dialogue with space." Richard observed her with renewed interest. "You speak like an artist, and you speak like someone who has never allowed art to touch your life," she responded, sustaining his gaze. A dense silence settled between them. Claire realized she had touched some sensitive point, but she didn't regret it. If they were, Going to live together for 30 days, it was better to establish from the beginning that she would not be just a puppet in his social experiment. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Martha, the housekeeper, bringing the dessert. "Mr. Bennett, Miss Helen Davidson confirmed she will be here tomorrow at 9 o'clock, she announced, serving 2 cups of chocolate mousse. "Great," replied Richard, still looking at Claire. "Tomorrow, your transformation officially begins." Claire tasted the dessert in silence, thinking that the true transformation might not be exactly what Richard was planning. There was something in the air, a peculiar energy that suggested the next 30 days held surprises for all involved. Helen Davidson arrived punctually at 9 o'clock the next morning. At 45, she maintained the elegance that had made her an icon of American fashion in previous decades. Her green eyes, deep and experienced, analyzed Claire with genuine interest, while Richard made the introductions in the office. "So you're Richard's new project," Helen commented, her deep and melodious voice carrying a tone that Claire couldn't quite decipher. There was something ironic, perhaps even provocative, in the way she looked at Richard when pronouncing the word project. "Actually," Claire responded, keeping her chin up, "I am a person, not a project, and I accepted participating in this agreement for my own reasons." A subtle smile appeared on Helen's lips. "Interesting," she murmured, giving Richard a significant look. "You've always had a special talent for finding surprising people, haven't you, Richard?" The billionaire adjusted his tie, a gesture that Claire was beginning to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "I'll leave you two at ease," he said, heading to the door. "I have important meetings today." As soon as Richard left, Helen visibly relaxed. She sat in one of the leather armchairs and gestured for Claire to do the same. "Now we can talk for real," she said, her tone changing to something warmer and more genuine. "You and Richard have history," Claire stated, not as a question, but as an observation. Helen laughed softly. "Perceptive. Yes, we have a history, and that's exactly why I'm here, because I know exactly what it's like to be part of Richard Bennett's projects." In the next 2 hours, Helen conducted a conversation that oscillated between etiquette lessons and subtle revelations about the world Claire was about to enter. She spoke about the unwritten codes of high society, about how true power rarely displayed itself in an ostentatious way, about how the widest smiles often hid the worst intentions. "You have a naturally elegant posture," Helen observed while Claire practiced how to sit properly. "You were a ballet dancer, weren't you?" "How do you know?" "The way you move. Your gestures have their own grammar." Helen paused, observing her attentively. "Why did you stop?" Claire felt the familiar weight of memory in her chest. "The project where I danced lost its funding. It was a social work with children from the periphery. When it ended, it was as if a piece of me had been torn out." Helen nodded, understanding. "I know well what it's like to have your passion transformed into impossibility. After I denounced the abuses in the fashion industry, many doors closed to me. Is that why you accepted to help with this situation?" "I accepted because, unlike what Richard thinks, you don't need to be transformed," Helen responded, her green eyes fixed on Claire. "You already possess everything that's necessary. You just need to rediscover it." The rest of the morning was dedicated to practical lessons: how to properly hold utensils, how to behave in different social situations, how to modulate your voice for different contexts. Claire absorbed everything with an ease that surprised even Helen. "You have a natural gift for this," the mentor commented during lunch, which served as a practical lesson in table etiquette. "It's as if your body remembered a previous life." "Maybe it's because I never really felt part of any world," Claire reflected, manipulating the utensils with growing confidence. "Neither when I danced professionally, nor when I was on the streets. I've always been an observer." In the afternoon, they were interrupted by the arrival of a team of personal shoppers and image consultants. Helen naturally took command of the situation, guiding the team on how to highlight Claire's natural beauty without transforming her into a copy of New York socialites. "The goal is not to erase who you are," Helen explained as they selected pieces of clothing, "but to give you the tools to navigate this new environment without losing your essence." At the end of the day, when the last consultant had already left, Helen and Claire shared tea on the balcony, watching the sun set over Central Park. The silence between them was comfortable, as if they had known each other for years. "Claire," Helen finally said, her tone more serious, "I need you to understand something. Richard is not a bad man, but he lives in a world where people are seen as pieces on a board. Be careful not to become just another piece in his game." Claire absorbed the warning in silence, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the park. "Perhaps," she replied after a moment, "it's he who needs to learn that some pieces have a life of their own." The first week of intensive training was coming to an end when Claire received unexpected news during breakfast. Richard, who was rarely present at meals, entered the dining room with a tense expression on his face. "Your posture classes start this afternoon," he announced, sitting at the table. "The teacher will arrive at 2 o'clock. Claire noticed something different in his tone of voice. "And what's the problem?" "There's no problem at all," Richard quickly responded, but the way he avoided her gaze said otherwise. "It's just, well, I just found out who the teacher is. Apparently, Helen recommended him." Before Claire could question further, Helen entered the room, her elegant presence filling the environment. "Ah, I see you're already telling her about Professor Robert," she commented, an enigmatic smile on her lips. The name hit Claire like lightning. Her cup trembled slightly when she placed it on the saucer. "Robert Mitchell?" she asked, her voice just a whisper. "You know each other?" Richard asked, his interest clearly aroused by Claire's reaction. "Robert was my ballet teacher in the social project," Claire responded, her hands now firmly intertwined on her lap. He is one of the best teachers I've ever known." Helen observed the scene with interest. "The world is indeed small," she commented, serving herself coffee. "Robert is teaching at a neighborhood school now. When I mentioned that we needed someone to work on posture and movement, he was the first person who came to mind." The rest of the morning passed in a blur for Claire. While practicing diction with Helen, her mind wandered to memories of rehearsals at the social project, performances for the community, the dreams they shared of transforming lives through dance. At 2 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Claire was in the office, trying to concentrate on an etiquette book, when she heard the familiar voice echoing down the hallway. Her heart raced. Robert Mitchell entered the room, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. At 45, he still maintained the impeccable posture of a dancer, but his eyes carried a sadness that Claire didn't remember seeing before. "Claire," he said simply, his voice choked with emotion. "Professor," she responded, instinctively rising. Into first position ballet, a habit she had never lost. You're alive," he murmured, taking a step toward her. "After the project ended, I searched for everyone. Some I managed to help place in other schools, but you simply disappeared." Claire felt tears burning her eyes. I couldn't continue. Dance was everything to me. When we lost the space, the funding, the costumes, it was like losing my identity." Helen and Richard observed the scene in silence from the door. It was the first time Claire had spoken openly about her past. "But you never stopped dancing, did you?" Robert asked, an understanding smile on his face. "I know you didn't. Dance is in you, Claire. It's not something you learn or lose. It's something you are." "How do you know?" she asked, discreetly wiping away a tear. "Because your posture is still perfect. Your movements still have the same grace as before. Even now, standing still, your body speaks the language of dance." Richard cleared his throat lightly, reminding everyone of his presence. "Perhaps we should start the class," he suggested, his businesslike tone contrasting with the emotion of the moment. "Of course," Robert agreed, resuming his professional posture. "Claire, let's start with some basic alignment exercises. I want to see how your body has responded to all these years." The next 2 hours were a rediscovery. Claire felt every muscle in her body awaken with the familiar exercises. It was as if a dormant part of her soul was finally waking up. Helen observed everything with a satisfied smile, while Richard seemed divided between fascination and concern. The way Claire moved, the evident connection between her and Robert, the transformation happening before his eyes. None of this was in his carefully elaborated plans. "Extraordinary," murmured Helen, approaching Richard. "She doesn't need to be transformed, Richard. She's already extraordinary. She just needed a chance to shine again." Richard didn't respond, but his eyes didn't leave Claire, who was now executing a series of pas de bras with the grace of a true ballerina. Something in his chest tightened, a strange sensation, almost uncomfortable, that he couldn't name. A week after the reunion with Robert, Claire's transformation was visible, not only in her external appearance, now impeccably dressed in designer clothes selected by Helen, but mainly in her presence. There was a renewed confidence in her movements, a light in her eyes that had been dormant for so long. However, while Claire flourished, a storm was forming behind the scenes. Brittany Morgan, Richard's ex-fiancée, had not simply disappeared after the engagement scandal. On the contrary, her public humiliation of Richard had only increased her thirst for revenge. "So it's true," she asked her father during lunch at the Manhattan Country Club. "Richard is really hosting a homeless woman in his penthouse?" Alexander Morgan, chairman of the board of the largest investment bank in the country, and Richard's main investor, looked at his daughter with concern. "Brittany, don't you think you've already caused enough problems?" "Problems?" she laughed, a sound without humor. "Dad, that man humiliated me for months, treating our relationship like a business merger. Now he thinks he can clean his image with this ridiculous charity project." At their table in the VIP area of the club, father and daughter perfectly represented New York's elite, impeccable appearances masking deep tensions. Alexander sighed, setting down his utensils. "What are you planning, Brittany?" "Nothing much," she replied, a dangerous smile on her lips. "I just think the public deserves to know the truth about his social experiment." Meanwhile, in Richard's apartment, Claire was participating in another class with Robert. Her movements had evolved significantly, and now they were working on a small choreography that blended classical ballet with contemporary dance. "Your expressiveness is even better than before," Robert commented, watching Claire execute a particularly complex sequence. "It's as if you had stored all the emotions of these years, and now they are finding a channel to flow." Helen, who was watching the class while reclining in an armchair, smiled in approval. "That's exactly what we need for the next challenge," she commented. Claire stopped her movements, intrigued. "What challenge?" "In 2 weeks, there will be an important gala event at MoMA," Helen explained. "It will be your first official public appearance. The press will be there, as well as all of New York high society." Claire's heart accelerated. Despite all the progress she had made, the idea of facing that world still frightened her. "And if I'm not ready?" "You're more than ready," Robert affirmed with conviction. "In fact, you always were. You just needed to rediscover it." The sound of the elevator announced Richard's arrival. He entered the room looking worried, his cell phone still in his hand. Upon seeing Claire dancing, however, his countenance momentarily softened. "How is she doing?" he asked Robert, his eyes still fixed on Claire. "Extraordinarily well," the teacher replied. "In fact, I was thinking of incorporating dance elements into her presentation at the MoMA event." Richard frowned. "I don't know if that would be appropriate." "Why not?" Helen intervened. "It would be a perfect way to show that Claire is not just another socialite in training. She has a unique gift, a story of her own." Claire observed the discussion in silence, perceiving the undercurrents of tension. Richard seemed divided between the desire to control every aspect of his experiment and the evident fascination with Claire's natural talent. "We need to talk," he finally said, addressing Helen. "In private." The two withdrew to the office, leaving Claire and Robert continuing with the class, but Claire couldn't concentrate fully on the movements. Something in Richard's expression had disturbed her. In the office, Richard showed Helen a series of messages on his cell phone. "Brittany is planning something," he said, his voice tense. "My contacts informed me that she hired a photographer to follow Claire." Helen remained calm, but her green eyes hardened. "What exactly do you fear they will discover, Richard? That Claire has a past, that she really lived on the streets. Wasn't that the point of your experiment?" "It's not that simple." Richard ran his hands through his hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability. "Brittany has influence. Her father is my main investor. If she decides to turn this into a media circus, so that's what really worries you? Your investments? Richard stared at Helen, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. You don't understand. It's not just about money. It's about... About what, Richard? Helen pressed, her voice soft, but firm. About Claire? About how she is transforming into something you didn't expect? About how she is affecting you in a way you didn't plan? The silence that followed was deafening. From the other room, they could hear the soft music that accompanied Claire's exercises, a melancholy melody that seemed to emphasize the weight of the moment. The morning after the tense conversation between Richard and Helen, the atmosphere in the apartment was charged. Claire noticed the change as soon as she entered the dining room for breakfast. Helen was not present, something unusual in recent days, and Richard barely touched his coffee, absorbed in his tablet. Did something happen? Claire asked, serving herself a cup of tea. Richard looked up, seeming to notice her presence for the first time. Why did you never tell me about the ballet? The question caught her by surprise. You never asked, she answered simply. Besides, that part of my life seemed buried. And now? How do you feel resurrecting it? Claire studied his face for a moment, trying to understand the true nature of that questioning. It's like breathing after being submerged for a long time, she answered honestly. But why does that bother you so much? Richard set aside the tablet, finally facing her directly. It doesn't bother me. It just complicates things. Complicates your experiment, you mean? Claire corrected, her voice maintaining a surprising calm. Because now you realize you can't mold me exactly as you planned. It's not that simple. Actually, it's simpler than you think, she continued, rising from the table with the elegance that was now natural to her. You're used to controlling everything and everyone around you, but people aren't stocks, Richard. They can't be controlled or predicted. The silence that followed was interrupted by Helen's abrupt arrival. Her normally composed face betrayed concern. We need to talk, she announced, addressing both of them. Now. Helen spread her tablet on the table. On the screen, a gossip blog displayed photos of Claire dancing in the park, clearly taken before her transformation. The headline was provocative: Richard Bennett's new charity project, The True Story. Brittany has begun her attack, Helen explained, her eyes fixed on Richard. But this is just the beginning. She has more material and intends to release it gradually to create the maximum impact possible. Claire observed the photos with surprising calm. And what's the problem? These photos show exactly who I am. A ballet dancer who lost everything, but never lost her essence. The problem, Richard intervened, his voice tense, is that this can ruin everything. My investors, the social project you want to create. No, Claire firmly interrupted him. The real problem is that it threatens your control over the narrative. But you know what? Maybe it's exactly what we need. Helen smiled, a gleam of the approval in her eyes. What do you have in mind? Let's use the MoMA event to tell our own story, Claire proposed, her posture erect and confident. Not the story Brittany wants to tell, nor the one Richard planned. The true story. And what would that story be? Richard asked, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension in his voice. The story of how art can survive even in the most adverse circumstances. Of how dignity is not in the clothes we wear or the places we frequent, but in the way we remain true to ourselves. Helen applauded softly. Brilliant. And you can tell that story through dance. No, Richard protested, rising abruptly. It's too risky. We can't what, Richard? Claire challenged him, approaching him. Show that I'm more than your social experiment, that I have my own story, my own art. The look they exchanged was intense, laden with unspoken emotions. Richard felt something move inside him, an uncomfortable sensation of loss of control mixed with growing admiration. 3 days, he finally said. We have 3 days until the MoMA event. If we're going to do this, it has to be perfect. It will be, Claire assured, a soft smile on her lips. Because for the first time since we started this, We're going to show something true." Helen observed the interaction with interest. The dynamic between them had subtly changed. It was no longer a billionaire conducting a social experiment, but a man beginning to question his own convictions in front of a woman who refused to be just a project. "Robert needs to be informed immediately," Helen commented, already picking up her cell phone. "We have a lot of work ahead." Claire nodded, her mind already beginning to formulate the choreography that would tell her story. It would be a dance that spoke of loss and recovery, of falls and new beginnings, of dignity that persists even when everything else is gone. Richard remained silent, his eyes following Claire as she moved around the room, her body already sketching small dance movements. For the first time, he wondered who was really being transformed in that story. The 3 days leading up to the MoMA event were intense. Richard's apartment was transformed into an improvised studio with furniture moved aside to create space for rehearsals. Robert practically moved in, working tirelessly with Claire to create a choreography that was both technically impressive and emotionally true. Helen supervised everything, dividing her time between practical preparations for the event and Claire's regular classes, which were not interrupted despite the new priority. "The dance will be more impactful if you maintain the posture and elegance you've achieved," she explained. Richard, in turn, seemed divided between his need for control and a growing fascination with the creative process unfolding in his home. He frequently paused his work to observe the rehearsals, hypnotized by the way Claire moved. "She's extraordinary," Helen commented, finding him one night watching a late rehearsal from the balcony. "And you're beginning to realize it, aren't you?" Richard didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on Claire as she executed a particularly emotional sequence. "It's different from what I expected," he finally admitted. "What exactly did you expect, Richard?" Helen asked softly. "To transform a woman into your version of perfection, to create a story you could control." "I wanted to prove something," he replied, his voice low. "To Brittany, to society, to myself. And what are you proving now?" Before Richard could respond, they were interrupted by Robert, who was calling Claire for another repetition. The music began again, a classical piece modified with contemporary elements that Claire had personally chosen. "Feel the music, Claire," Robert guided. "Let it tell your story. Each movement should speak of your journey." Claire closed her eyes, allowing her body to respond to the melody. Her movements flowed naturally, blending classical ballet technique with more free and personal expressions. It was as if each gesture told a chapter of her life, the joy of dance, the pain of loss, dignity in adversity, the hope of a new beginning. "Now the transition," Robert indicated. "Show the moment of change." Claire executed a series of turns that ended in a contained, almost painful movement before expanding into an explosion of expressiveness. It was the moment when her story met Richard's, but not as he had planned. "Perfect," Robert applauded. "Now the finale." The finale of the choreography was the most impactful moment. Claire began in a position that suggested submission, but gradually rose, not as someone who was transformed by another, but as someone who rediscovered her own strength. Richard observed everything with a mixture of emotions he couldn't name. Something was changing inside him, something fundamental and irreversible. "Tomorrow we'll do a dress rehearsal," Helen announced, when they finally ended the rehearsal. The designer made alterations to allow for the dance movements. Claire nodded, wiping the sweat from her face with a towel. Her eyes met Richard's on the balcony, and for a moment, something silent and significant passed between them. "Do you think this will work?" he asked later, when everyone had already retired and they shared a rare moment alone on the balcony. "Depends on what you consider success," Claire replied, observing the city lights. "If you expect me to present myself as your perfect creation, probably not. But if you're willing to accept that true transformation is a two-way street." "What do you mean?" Claire turned to face him, her eyes shining with an intensity that captured him. "Don't you realize, Richard, while you were trying to transform me, something in you was also changing?" The silence that followed was filled by the sound of Central Park in the background, a constant reminder that the world continued turning while they lived that moment suspended in time. "I'm afraid," Richard finally admitted, his voice just a whisper. "Of what?" "Of losing control, of not knowing what happens next." Claire smiled softly. "Sometimes, Richard, the best things in life are those we cannot control." That night, as the apartment finally quieted, each reflected on what the next day would bring. The MoMA event would not just be a presentation, it would be a moment of truth, of vulnerability, of real transformation. And no one, not even Richard Bennett, could predict its outcome. The day before the MoMA event dawned with an electric energy in the air. Claire's dress had arrived, a creation in shades of deep blue that seemed to flow like water when she moved. The designer had done an exceptional job, incorporating elements that allowed total freedom of movement without compromising elegance. "It's perfect," Helen commented, watching Claire try on the dress for the first time. "It looks like it was made for dancing." The dress rehearsal was scheduled for that afternoon, but before that, an unexpected event changed the course of the day. Alexander Morgan, Brittany's father and Richard's main investor, requested an urgent meeting. "I can't postpone this," Richard explained to Helen and Claire during breakfast. "Alexander never requests meetings without an important reason. He's going to try to pressure you," Helen warned, her expression serious. "Brittany has certainly already involved him in her plans." Claire, who was adjusting the strap of her leotard for the morning rehearsal, intervened. "Do you want me to go with you?" Richard looked at her, surprised by the offer. "No, this is something I need to face alone." "Are you sure?" Claire insisted, approaching him. "Sometimes facing things alone is not the best strategy." Something in the way she said this made Richard pause. It was as if Claire was talking about something much bigger than just that meeting. "Keep your rehearsal," he finally decided. "You need to be ready for tomorrow. I'll deal with Alexander." Alexander Morgan's office occupied the top floor of a commercial building in Midtown Manhattan. The view of the city was spectacular, but that morning Richard barely noticed it. His mind was divided between the impending meeting and Claire's rehearsals. "Richard," Alexander greeted him with calculated coldness, "sit down." The atmosphere in the room was heavy, laden with unspoken tensions. Alexander slid a folder across the mahogany desk. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his eyes fixed on Richard. "I imagine it's something related to our investments." "They are detailed reports about your protégé," Alexander replied, opening the folder. "Brittany conducted quite a thorough investigation." Richard maintained his neutral expression, although his heart was racing. And we discovered some interesting things. For example, that she wasn't just any homeless person. She was a talented ballet dancer, part of a social project that went bankrupt. Curious that you didn't mention this. "I didn't see the relevance in..." "The relevance," Alexander interrupted him, "is in the fact that you're turning this into a media circus, using a tragic story to clean your image after the fiasco with my daughter." Richard felt anger growing in his chest, but controlled it. "It's nothing like that." "No?" Alexander smiled without humor. "Then tell me, what is it? Because from my point of view, you're risking your reputation and by extension our investments on a questionable personal project." "Claire is not a project," Richard heard himself saying, surprising himself with the vehemence in his She is what, Richard?" Alexander pressed. "A woman you're using to prove a point, or something more?" The silence that followed was heavy. Richard realized he didn't have a simple answer to that question. "I'll be direct," Alexander continued. "Either you end this circus immediately, or I withdraw all my investments from your businesses. And believe me, other investors will follow me." Richard rose slowly, adjusting his suit. "You know what the difference is between us, Alexander? You see people as numbers on a spreadsheet. I used to be like that too. But Claire, she showed me something different." "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Richard conceded, heading toward the door. "But for the first time in a long time, it's a mistake that makes me feel alive." When he returned to the apartment, he found Claire in the middle of a particularly intense rehearsal. She danced as if her life depended on it, each movement, laden with emotion and meaning. Robert, who was conducting the rehearsal, was the first to notice him. "Something wrong?" he asked, perceiving Richard's tense expression. "No," he replied, his eyes fixed on Claire. "In fact, for the first time, something is very right." Claire stopped her dance, feeling the different energy in the environment. Her eyes met Richard's, and in that moment, something silent but deeply significant passed between them. "Continue," Richard said softly. "You are perfect." Helen, who observed everything from the balcony, hid a smile. The transformation she had predicted was finally happening, not just in Claire, but mainly in Richard. The morning of the MoMA event arrived with a mixture of expectation and nervousness. The New York sky dawned in a perfect blue, as if nature itself wanted to contribute to the spectacle that was to come. Claire woke before sunrise and was found by Helen practicing her movements on the balcony, her body naturally responding to the music only she could hear. "You're ready," Helen stated, not as a question but as an observation. "I am," Claire replied, stopping her movements, "but not in the way Richard initially planned. I think he's already realized that," Helen smiled, handing her a cup of tea, "and maybe it's exactly what he needed." The morning passed in a series of meticulous preparations. The blue dress was carefully transported to MoMA, where Claire would get ready. A team of makeup artists and hairdressers was assigned to work with her, under Helen's attentive supervision. Richard spent the morning in emergency meetings with his public relations team. News about Alexander Morgan's ultimatum was already circulating in the financial market backstage, and his company's stocks were beginning to feel the impact. "Mr. Bennett," his main advisor argued, "perhaps we should consider postponing the event. The situation is delicate." "The event happens today," he replied, with a firmness that admitted no discussion. "And it will happen exactly as we planned." When he arrived at MoMA in the late afternoon, Richard was greeted by a scenario that exceeded his expectations. The space had been transformed. The main area housed chairs arranged in a semicircle, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the size of the venue. In the center, a circular space had been left free for Claire's presentation. Guests began to arrive punctually at 7 o'clock. The cream of New York society, journalists, art critics, and of course Brittany Morgan, who made a point of appearing in a flashy red dress, accompanied by her father. "There's still time to cancel this," Alexander murmured as he passed by Richard. "You don't understand, do you?" Richard calmly replied. "This is already much bigger than any of us." In the improvised dressing room, Claire was going through the final preparations. The blue dress seemed to capture and reflect every nuance of light, creating an almost ethereal effect when she moved. "5 minutes," Helen announced, entering the dressing room. She stopped upon seeing Claire, her eyes filling with contained tears. "You look ready," Claire completed, smiling. "I just need one thing." "What?" "To talk to Richard. Alone." Helen nodded, understanding, and left to fetch the billionaire. Moments later, Richard entered the dressing room, stopping abruptly upon seeing Claire. Time seemed to suspend for a moment. Claire was stunning, but not in the artificial way he had initially planned. Her beauty came from something deeper, more truthful. "I need to tell you something," Claire began, her voice firm despite the contained emotion. "What's going to happen out there? It's not the ending you planned." "I know," Richard softly replied. "No, you don't know," she took a step toward him. "Because what I'm going to dance is not just my story or your attempt to transform me. It's something that happened between us, something that neither of us planned." Richard felt his heart accelerate. "Claire, you tried to change me," she continued, "but in the process, something in you also changed. And that's what I'm going to show out there, not a superficial transformation, but something much deeper." Before Richard could respond, Helen knocked on the door. "It's time," she announced. Claire took a deep breath, adjusting her dress one last time. "Do you trust me?" she asked Richard. He looked at her for a long moment before responding, more than I've ever trusted anyone. The murmur in the main. Hall decreased when the lights dimmed. Richard took his place in the front row, conscious of the glances and whispers around him. Brittany, a few seats to the right, maintained a smirk on her lips. The music began, the first soft chords of the piece Claire had chosen. And then she entered. The silence at MoMA was absolute when Claire began her presentation. Her body, wrapped in the blue dress that floated like water, initiated the first movements with a delicacy that immediately captured the attention of all present. The choreography began with contained, almost shy gestures representing her life before the fall of the social project. Gradually, the movements became more intense, more dramatic, telling the story of loss and overcoming that she had lived on the streets. In the front row, Richard watched, hypnotized. Each of Claire's movements seemed to touch something deep inside him, awakening emotions he didn't even know he possessed. Beside him, Helen smiled softly, as if she knew exactly what was happening. The music changed tone, becoming more intense. Claire executed a series of precise turns that demonstrated not only her impeccable technique, but also the inner strength that had never abandoned her. Her arms moved with fluid grace, drawing in the air the story of her resistance. Brittany, who initially maintained a smirk, gradually lost her composure. The presentation was not what she expected. It wasn't a superficial display of etiquette and good manners. It was true art, raw and honest. Robert, observing from a discreet corner, felt silent tears running down his face. His former student had not only survived, she was being reborn before everyone, stronger and more authentic than ever. The most impactful moment came when Claire began the part of the choreography that represented her encounter with Richard. The movements changed, becoming a delicate dance between resistance and surrender, between transformation and authenticity. At one point, Claire looked directly at Richard while executing a particularly emotional sequence. Their eyes met, and, in that instant, something deep and true passed between them. The audience, even without fully understanding, felt the energy of that moment. Alexander Morgan, who had arrived prepared to witness a failure, found himself involuntarily moved. The woman dancing before him was not the pathetic figure his daughter had described. She was an accomplished artist, someone who transformed pain into beauty. The music reached its crescendo, and Claire initiated the final sequence, the most technically challenging and the most emotionally significant. Her movement spoke of liberation, of self-discovery, of a transformation that went far beyond appearances. The blue dress spun and floated around her as if it had a life of its own, creating a stunning visual effect. But it wasn't the clothing that captured attention. It was the woman inside it, her strength, her grace, her truth. The last chords of the music sounded when Claire executed the final movement. Instead of ending in a traditional ballet pose, she extended a hand toward Richard, like a silent invitation to a different dance, one they would create together. The silence that followed lasted only a second before the audience exploded in applause. People stood up, some openly crying, others simply smiling, touched by something they couldn't fully explain. Helen was the first to reach Claire, wrapping her in a tight hug. "You did it," she whispered in her ear. "You showed them who you really are." Robert approached next, his eyes still shining with emotion. "Claire, my girl, you exceeded all expectations." But Claire was looking for a specific face in the crowd that was now approaching to congratulate her. Her eyes found Richard's, who remained in his place as if paralyzed by the intensity of the moment. Brittany, realizing that her humiliation plan had transformed into a triumph for Claire, abruptly stood up and headed for the exit, followed by her father, who cast a final thoughtful look in Richard's direction. The journalists present were already taking photos and making frantic notes. The story they would tell would not be about a social experiment or an attempt at superficial transformation. It would be about art, truth, and the transformative power of true love, not just romantic love, but love for art, for life, for oneself. Claire remained in the center of the hall, receiving congratulations with a natural grace that no etiquette class could have taught. Her smile was radiant, but her eyes continued seeking Richard, who finally began to move in her direction. The cocktail that followed the presentation transformed into a spontaneous celebration. The buzz in MoMA's main hall was of pure admiration, with groups of guests commenting on every aspect of Claire's performance. The art critics present were already writing on their tablets, their expressions indicating they had witnessed something truly special. Claire had briefly withdrawn to change clothes, accompanied by Helen. When she returned to the hall wearing an elegant silver dress more appropriate for the cocktail, she found a completely different atmosphere than she had imagined. "You changed everything," Helen commented, observing people's reactions. Not just the narrative Brittany tried to create, but the very essence of what was happening here. Indeed, the comments circulating were not about the transformation of a homeless woman into a society lady. They were about art, resistance, authenticity, about how true elegance comes from within, from an inner strength that no adversity can break. Robert, who was chatting with some dance critics present, made a point of sharing the story of the social project where Claire had danced. "What you saw today," he explained, "is not the result of a few weeks of training. It's the fruit of years of dedication to art, of a talent that not even the worst circumstances could erase." In a more reserved corner of the hall, Alexander Morgan surprised Richard with an unexpected approach. "I need to admit something," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I was wrong." Richard looked at him with surprise. About? About all this being just a media circus, what we saw today was true art. And more than that, it was a lesson in humanity that we all needed. Before Richard could respond, Claire approached them. Her presence had a magnetic quality that attracted all eyes. "Mr. Morgan," she greeted with a natural elegance that had nothing to do with etiquette lessons, "I hope you enjoyed the presentation." Alexander studied her for a moment before responding. "More than enjoyed, Miss Claire. I was deeply touched, and I would like to make a proposal." Claire and Richard exchanged a quick glance. "What kind of proposal?" she asked. "I would like to be the first investor in your social project, not as a marketing maneuver, but as a true commitment to art and social transformation." The surprise on Claire's face was genuine. "Are you serious?" "I've never been more serious," Alexander replied, a soft smile on his lips. "Your presentation reminded me why I fell in love with art when I was young, before I got lost in numbers and business." Helen, who approached in time to hear the conversation, smiled discreetly. The transformation was happening at levels no one had predicted. "Excuse me," Richard gently interrupted. "May I speak with Claire in private for a moment?" He led her to the museum's balcony, where the night view of New York created a breathtaking scenario. For a few moments, they remained in silence, just absorbing the magnitude of the moment. "You were right," Richard finally said, his voice laden with emotion. "About everything." "About what, specifically?" Claire asked, although her eyes said she already knew the answer. "About true transformation not being something we can control or plan. About how sometimes we need to get lost to find ourselves." Claire moved closer to him, her eyes shining with the reflected light of the city. "And what did you find, Richard?" "I found something that no money can buy, no plan can predict." He paused, searching for the right words. "I found the truth I was trying to deny from the beginning." "And what is that truth?" Richard extended his hand, gently touching Claire's face. "That while I was trying to transform you, you were transforming me. And that for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of that change." The moment was interrupted by Helen, who appeared discreetly on the balcony. "Sorry to interrupt, but the journalists are waiting for an interview. They want to hear about the social project." Claire smiled, a smile that illuminated her entire face. "Shall we tell them our story?" "Our story," Richard repeated, savoring the words. "Yes, let's tell it. But this time, let's tell the truth. About how sometimes we need to lose everything to find something much more precious." Together, they returned to the hall, where a new chapter of their lives was about to begin. A chapter that neither had planned, but that seemed infinitely more real and more true than anything they could have imagined. The morning after the presentation at MoMA dawned with New York City in a frenzy. The headlines of the main newspapers and websites spoke of nothing else. The ballet dancer who conquered the elite, art and transformation at MoMA, the social experiment that became a story of overcoming. Each outlet had its own version of the events, but all agreed on one point. Something extraordinary had happened the previous night. Claire woke up early as usual and found Richard's penthouse filled with flowers. Arrangements of all kinds and sizes arrived at every moment, accompanied by cards from personalities in the art world and New York society. "Impressive, isn't it?" Helen commented, entering the room with 2 cups of coffee. But nothing compared to this. She extended her tablet, showing Claire the emails that had arrived during the night. They were proposals, dozens of them, from dance schools wanting Claire to teach, from business people interested in investing in the social project, from ballet companies offering partnerships. The previous night's presentation had touched something deep in the heart of New York City. "It's a bit overwhelming," Claire admitted, sitting on the sofa and accepting the cup of coffee offered by Helen. "It's just the beginning," Helen smiled. "But don't worry, we'll filter all this calmly. The important thing is that now you have options, you can choose your own path." Richard entered the room at that moment, already dressed for work, but with a different expression on his face. Lighter, more true. "Good morning," he greeted, his eyes lingering a bit longer on Claire. "I just spoke with Alexander Morgan. He wants to schedule a meeting today to discuss the investment in the social project." "So quickly?" Claire asked, surprised. "Apparently your presentation not only moved him, but also awakened old memories," Richard explained, sitting beside her. "He told me his late wife was a ballet dancer. Seeing you dance yesterday made him remember why he fell in love with art in the first place." Helen observed the interaction of the two with a discreet smile. The dynamic between them had completely changed. It was no longer the relationship between mentor and protégé, but something much deeper and more equal. "There's one more thing," Richard continued, his tone more serious. "Robert called. He wants to talk to you about a proposal." Claire straightened up, immediately attentive. "What kind of proposal?" "He didn't go into details, but mentioned something about reactivating the social project where you danced. Apparently, after yesterday, several doors have opened." Claire's face lit up with this possibility. The idea of being able to rescue the project that had meant so much in her life, of being able to offer other people the same opportunity she had received, was more than she could have dreamed. "But before any decision," Helen intervened, "we need to talk about something important." She made a significant pause. "The deadline." Claire and Richard exchanged a glance. The original agreement provided for 30 days of coexistence, culminating in a public wedding. But after the events of the previous night, everything had changed. "The deadline doesn't matter anymore," Richard said softly. "In fact, nothing in the original agreement matters anymore. What happened was much bigger than anything we planned." "So, what happens now?" Claire asked, her voice just a whisper. Richard stood up, walking to the balcony. The morning sun bathed New York City in a golden light, and the view of Central Park had never seemed so significant. "Now," he replied, turning to face her, "you are free to choose your path. You can proceed with the social project. You can accept any of the proposals you received. You can do what your heart commands." Helen cleared her throat discreetly. "And what about you two?" The silence that followed was laden with meaning. Claire stood up too, joining Richard on the balcony. The city stretched before them, full of possibilities. "Maybe," Claire finally said, "we can discover that together. Without deadlines, without agreements, without expectations. Just together." Richard looked at her, finding in her eyes the same truth he had discovered the night before. "Together," he repeated, as if testing the flavor of the word. Helen smiled, discreetly collecting her coffee cup. "Well, I think my work here is done, although," she added with a mischievous gleam in her eyes, "I would love to continue being part of this story." "You will always be part of it," Claire affirmed with conviction. "All of you are part of what happened here, of the transformation that happened in all of us." The meeting with Robert took place that same afternoon, in a small dance school in Brooklyn where he now taught. The place was simple, but there was something special in the energy of the place, in the children practicing in the main hall, in the worn mirrors that reflected dreams in formation. "This place reminds me of our project," Claire commented, watching a girl try to perfect a turn. "That's why I chose here to talk to you," Robert smiled. "Claire, after your presentation yesterday, I received several calls. Important people want to invest in social dance projects." Claire nodded, already having an idea of what would come next. "And you want to reactivate our old project?" "Not exactly," Robert replied, surprising her. "I want to create something new, something bigger. And I want you to be not just a teacher, but an artistic director." The proposal caught Claire by surprise. "Me? But you're the perfect person," Robert insisted. "You've lived both sides. You know art from the inside, and you know exactly what it means to lose access to it. Besides, after yesterday, your name carries weight. People want to associate with your story." Claire absorbed the information in silence. Through the office window, she could see Richard talking on the phone in the corridor. He had made a point of accompanying her, but gave her space for this important conversation. "It would be a large-scale project," Robert continued, "with various units throughout the city, reaching children and young people who normally wouldn't have access to dance. Alexander Morgan has already committed to the initial investment, and others are interested." "And the children in your current project?" Claire asked, always concerned about who might be left behind. Robert smiled, proud. Of his former student, they would be automatically incorporated into the new project. In fact, this school would be our first unit. Claire's mind was already working on the possibilities. She imagined classical ballet classes mixed with urban dances, performances. In communities, exchange between different social realities. "I want to," she finally said, "but with one condition." "Which?" "I want it to be more than a dance school. I want to create a complete cultural center with other forms of art. A place where people can not only learn, but transform themselves through art." Robert nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly what I expected you to suggest." At this moment, Richard re-entered the office. His face showed that he also had news. "Alexander just confirmed," he announced. "The bank's board unanimously approved the investment in the project. And there's more. They want to create a specific foundation for cultural projects in communities." Claire felt her eyes fill with tears. It was as if the universe was conspiring to transform her greatest pain into her greatest victory. "There's one more thing," Robert added, opening a drawer in his desk. "I found this in the archives of the old project." He extended an old photo, a bit yellowed by time. In the image, a younger Claire smiled at the camera, surrounded by children in ballet clothes. It was the day of her first presentation as an assistant teacher. "You were always more than a ballet dancer," Robert said softly. "You are an inspiration." Richard observed the scene with a new understanding. The universe had a peculiar sense of humor. He had initiated this whole process thinking he would transform a homeless woman into a lady of society. But in the end, it was he who had been transformed. "So," he said, approaching Claire, "when do we start?" Claire looked from the photo to Robert and then to Richard. In each face, she saw different reflections of her own journey. "Actually," she smiled, "I think we've already started, from the first day in the park, when you saw me dancing." "No," Richard gently corrected. "It started much earlier. It started when you decided never to stop dancing, even when it seemed you had lost everything." Robert cleared his throat, moved. "Well, I think we have a lot of work ahead. What do you say we start planning our first unit?" During the following hours, the three pored over plans, projects, and ideas. Claire occasionally stopped to watch the children dancing in the hall next door, her heart overflowing with possibilities. During a pause, Richard found her alone, watching through the window the sunset that tinged the New York sky golden. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Claire smiled without taking her eyes off the horizon. "Only of not having realized earlier that sometimes we need to lose everything to find our true strength." 1 week after the meeting at the dance school, the project was beginning to take concrete form. Claire had transformed the dining room, of Richard's penthouse into an improvised office with architectural plans, proposals for cultural programs, and endless lists spread over the table. Helen, who continued to be a constant presence, now acted more as an advisor than a mentor. That morning, she watched Claire work with an approving smile on her face. "Have you thought of a name for the project?" she asked, serving herself a cup of coffee. Claire raised her eyes from the papers in front of her. "I've been thinking of continuous movement, because that's what art does. It continues moving, transforming, even in the most adverse circumstances." "Perfect," Helen approved. "It conveys exactly the essence of what you want to create." At that moment, Richard entered the room, bringing more news. "I just left a meeting with the Foundation's board," he announced, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "The funding for the next 5 units is guaranteed." Claire hugged him, moved. In the last few months, their relationship had transformed into something deep and true, built not on agreements or expectations, but on mutual understanding and respect. "And there's one more surprise," Richard continued, a special gleam in his eyes. "Brittany got in touch." Claire and Helen exchanged surprised looks. "And what did she want?" Helen asked, cautious. "To apologize," Richard replied, still seeming a bit surprised himself. "Apparently, our story made her reflect on her own actions. She wants to contribute to the project, not with money but with volunteer work." Claire smiled, understanding. Sometimes people need time to find their own path of transformation. At that moment, Robert appeared on the balcony, accompanied by a group of children, the first students of continuous movement, selected from underprivileged communities in the region. "They wanted to see the space before the official inauguration," he explained, smiling at seeing the children's amazed eyes. Claire approached the group, kneeling to be at their height. "Do you like to dance?" she asked gently. A small girl with colorful braids stepped forward. "I dance every day on the roof of my house," she replied shyly. "My mom says I look like a little bird." "I used to dance in improvised places too," Claire told her, her voice soft. "Sometimes in the park, sometimes on the street, because dance doesn't need a specific place. It happens where our heart is." The children looked at her fascinated, already captured by her natural gentleness and charisma. Richard, observing the scene, felt his heart expand with love and admiration. "Want to see something special?" Claire asked the group. When they all enthusiastically nodded, she stood up with grace and began to dance. It wasn't an elaborate choreography, like at MoMA, but something simple and pure, the kind of dance that comes directly from the soul. The children soon began to imitate her, creating a magical moment of connection through art. Helen discreetly wiped away a tear, while Robert smiled with pride at his former student. Richard remained silent, absorbing the beauty of the moment. When the improvised dance ended, the girl with the colorful braids asked, "Will you teach us to dance like that?" "I'll teach you to find your own dance," Claire replied, "because each person has a unique way of expressing themselves, a unique story, to tell through movement." Later, when the children had already left and the sun was beginning to set, Claire and Richard remained on the balcony, observing the city that had witnessed their transformation. "You know," she said softly, "when you proposed that crazy 30-day agreement to me, I thought I was just accepting a chance to start over. I didn't imagine I was beginning a completely new story." Richard hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "And I thought I was in control of everything, that I could plan every detail. Little did I know I was about to learn the most important lesson of my life." "And what was that lesson?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. "That sometimes we need to let life dance in its own way," he replied, gently twirling her in his arms, "and that the best steps are those we don't plan." The day of the inauguration of continuous movement dawned with a perfect blue sky over New York City. Since early morning, the movement at the Cultural Center was intense. Staff adjusted the last details, journalists began to arrive, and a special energy lingered in the air. Claire was in her new office, now artistic director of the project, when Helen entered, carrying an elegant box in her hands. "A gift for today," she announced, placing the box on the desk. Inside was a blue dress, not as elaborate as the one from MoMA, but equally special. It was made of a light fabric that allowed free movements, perfect for someone who might need to dance at any moment. "It's beautiful," Claire whispered, touching the delicate fabric. "I thought it appropriate," Helen smiled. "Blue like the park," where it all began. A knock on the door interrupted the moment. It was Robert, accompanied by a surprise, 5 of his former students from the social project that had closed. All had managed to continue in dance in some way, and now they were there to join the continuous movement team as assistant teachers. "We couldn't not be part of this," said one of the young women, hugging Claire emotionally. "You showed us that there's always a way back to art." The morning passed quickly between final preparations and rehearsals. The inauguration program included presentations by the new students, an exhibition of local art, and of course, a special presentation by Claire. Shortly before the event began, Richard found her on the terrace, her favorite place in the new building. She was stunning in the blue dress, but there was something more to her beauty. A serene confidence, a deep joy that came from being exactly where she should be. "Nervous?" he asked, approaching. "Curiously, no," she replied, smiling. "For the first time in my life, I feel I'm exactly where I should be, doing exactly what I should do." Richard looked at her with admiration. "You transformed everything, you know. Not just your own life, but mine, these children's, and entire communities." "We transformed," she gently corrected, "together." The sound of animated voices reached them. The public was beginning to enter the cultural center, a fascinating mixture of people from all social classes, united by art. There were children from underprivileged communities with their parents, members of high society, artists, journalists, and, surprisingly, Brittany. "She really came," Claire commented, observing Richard's ex-fiancée chatting amicably with Helen. "People can surprise us," Richard replied. "You taught me that." The event began with an emotional speech by Robert, recalling the journey that had brought them there. Next, the children's presentations drew tears and smiles from the audience. Each number had been carefully prepared to show not just technique, but mainly the pure joy of expressing oneself through art. Between presentations, Claire circulated through the space, chatting with guests, explaining the project, its goals and vision. She was no longer the woman Richard had found dancing in the park. She was a natural leader, someone who inspired confidence and admiration. Alexander Morgan, who observed everything with genuine interest, approached Richard at one point. "No," he commented. "When you started with this whole story, I thought it was just another of your calculated projects. But now I see it was something much bigger." "I didn't know at the beginning either," Richard admitted. "Sometimes the best things in life are those we don't plan." The most touching moment of the day came when Claire went up on stage for her presentation. It wasn't an elaborate choreography, like at MoMA, but something more intimate and personal. She danced a piece that spoke about new beginnings, about finding beauty in the most unexpected places. As she danced, images were projected on the walls, photos of the old social project, of the construction of the new center, of the children, rehearsing. It was a celebration not just of her personal journey, but of all the lives that had intertwined to create something extraordinary. At the end of her presentation, Claire did something unexpected. She invited all the children present to join her on stage. In a few minutes, the space was full of small dancers improvising their own movements, their laughter and joy filling the environment with a contagious energy. Richard observed everything. From the front row, his heart overflowing with emotion, at some point between that first encounter in the park and today, he had not only fallen in love with Claire, but rediscovered a part of himself he thought was lost, his capacity to be moved, to care, to see beauty beyond numbers and business.